Hi, everyone. Today, what we're going to do is wrap up the end of Veblen's book. So, today is actually going to be a relatively short lecture, pulling together some key ideas at the end of the book, but also looking at some more mechanisms through which people can display their status, specifically looking at duress. And this will be, like I said, a little bit shorter than what I'm going to do for next class. For the 14th, we're going to be doing our review. And so the review will be more comprehensive in terms of looking at the book, specifically with reference to the book report guidelines. So, before we get into the last few chapters, get our minds in the right place. What we've been doing is looking at the American social theory during the middle years. And Veblen is looking at a theory of social stratification. So again, as an American theorist, he is kind of looking at that micro level a lot, but he doesn't ignore structural forces at the same time. And we'll get into some of those connections between kind of the structural focuses and the elements of agency a little bit today. And basically, as a theory of social stratification, what he's trying to explain is the forms of class distinction in modern society. So at the beginning of the book, he talks about how people kind of separate themselves from one another in various ways according to the history in which they live. He says there's this kind of desire, instinctual desire to kind of dominate, to compete against other people. And based upon that competition, you kind of get that vertical ordering. And so that's what we're looking at here, how groups kind of distinguish themselves from one another, how people distinguish themselves from one another in modern society. And so basically, he talks about how, people recognize other people in relation to themselves. People recognize other people in relation to other people. And this promotes, judgments. And these judgments kind of filter into social feelings of worth and then also self feelings of worth, depending on kind of where people stack up in those rankings. And so in modern society, what we start to see with the emergence of capitalism and with the emergence of urbanization, property and wealth become kind of key identifying mechanisms with which you kind of are ranked and with which you rank yourself in comparison to other people. But in modern society, with urbanization, it becomes problematic because people don't know one another as they knew one another in smaller rural areas. And with capitalism, you don't know kind of somebody's worth in terms of how much money they have or how much money they don't. So you have to use kind of other mechanisms to identify yourself and to identify others. And we got into those mechanisms last class when we looked at kind of the symbolic measurement sticks of modernity. And so basically, here you're looking at work and how that ties into status, high status, what we call prestige, kind of a neutral status where people don't really see you as being high or low, just kind of in the middle. Or on the other hand, when you're on the bottom, that's the stigma. So, look at these different status markers connected to work. We talked about, a few different connections to work, but basically, the closer you are to productive work, the less status you're going to have. And the further away from productive work, the more status you're going to have, according to Veblen. And this kind of ties into leisure. Basically, if you live a life of leisure, that demonstrates to people that you have money to do so. You can't not work if you can't afford not to. So again, all these things kind of come back to those symbolic kind of measurements because it kind of shows your class position, the type of work you do, how much you work, how much you don't work, and then also the consumption as well. Displaying consumption, having people order your house, and these are different ways that people can see how much money you have by how much money you can waste on stuff. Specifically, you talked about kind of the non-productive goods that really don't do anything for you, just kind of sit on your walls or whatever they do. So that's what we're looking at. We looked at consumption, we looked at leisure and work, And those are kind of three main elements that people use to create these symbolic measurements. And those are the three main elements that kind of comprise the symbolic battles of modernity that create those forms of class distinction. And so Veblen concentrated one entire chapter on dress. So dress kind of ties directly into the conspicuous consumption because people can easily see it. It's easily visible when you're out and about, but also we can connect it to work as well. And so we'll get into that in a second. But he says dress is important because we use dress to kind of tell people through kind of what we wear, what we don't wear, kind of where we stand class wise. And like I mentioned before, it's an effective way of doing this because people can easily see it. It's easily visible. And for the most part, people can recognize the dress, whether it be kind of what you're wearing or the brand per se. And people are pretty good at kind of recognizing what you're wearing and the brand you're wearing and kind of putting you in a certain class. It's not always going to be 100%. You can buy something that's way out of your price range and wear it. And maybe, people think you're in one class, but really not. But for the most part, it becomes a way that we can, identify people and place them in a class position. And we can recognize it kind of within classes, but also kind of across class boundaries as well. And so here it gets into that combination of consumption, having the money to buy the clothing, having the money to buy specific kind of brands, or not having the money to do so. But also he connects it to leisure because he says a lot of the upper class individuals wear forms of clothing that you could never work in. So think about like high heels, for example. You could never work in a mill. You could never work in a factory if you're wearing high heels. Or, to some of the this kind of fancier clothing that you can never do blue collar kind of working class work in. So it kind of shows people not only kind of what class you're in, but it shows you kind of in terms of you're not a worker, you're more kind of a life of leisure. And so again, this ties into what we talked about last class. It's kind of a group-based performance. You not only kind of dress yourself for yourself, but you dress yourself for other people. And then, the other people can read and kind of recognize, what you're wearing and kind of use that symbolism as part of that symbolic measurement stick and kind of place you in one class or another. So, overall here, what I want to do with this last slide is kind of wrap up a lot of main ideas that he talks about at the end of the book. So I kept on talking about the symbolic yardstick of modernity, basically kind of a rules of the game, culture in modern society. And this culture doesn't appear out of thin air. So the measurement stick and how it measures is created by the ruling class, the upper class. So it kind of ties back into Marx a little bit when we talked about the German ideology, how Marx says, the ruling class also creates the ruling ideas. Veblen kind of agrees with Marx here. And he says that these standards, albeit arbitrary, so you could create the measurements in many different ways, but the measurement is created by those who have the power to create it, the upper class. So they set the standards that are recognized by themselves, by other people. And what happens through the socialization process, you start to learn the measurement stick. You start to learn the clothing. You start to learn the jobs. You start to learn kind of the leisure activities and kind of where you kind of place people in as a result. And you start to share a social psychology. So we say a shared psychology exists among all class members. And so you kind of are socialized in this culture, and the culture, once learned, becomes part of a personal but also a shared social psychology. And that psychology basically reflects culture as a whole, reflects that measurement stick that we've learned through socialization. So there you get into a little bit of Durkheim, that collective consciousness, that shared culture that people have through socialization. So, through socialization, people learn and endorse the status measurements, and the learning and the endorsement can be seen through how people act, what they wear, what they don't wear, their attitudes, how they evaluate certain things, so how they evaluate, one piece of clothing as having more status compared to another one, or one occupation having more status compared to another one, and also your desires and kind of what you want. He talks a lot about trying to mimic other people. So, people trying to mimic those above them in terms of their lifestyles and their class symbolisms. So overall, he says that we can recognize some differences among class members. He talks about differences in terms of geography sometimes too. Sometimes urban areas and rural areas can differ in terms of what carries high or low status. But although he recognizes that differences do exist, more or less the differences are small and by degree. So he says, yeah, you can find differences here and there, but for the most part, you kind of learn this same language, and you kind of all kind of speak and know the language. Although there may be some deviants out there who maybe don't endorse it or maybe reject it totally. Those people will exist. Again, going back to Durkheim, the deviants will always exist. But for the most part, this is how the game of class distinction, the game of status operates in modern society. And so if you want to get into that leisure class, if you want to get into the upper classes, so if you want to move from the working class to the middle class, from the middle class to the upper class, you basically have to, play the game as the game is written. You have to play by the rules. And that's how you get accepted into the higher classes. And I kind of talk about here, something he mentions at the beginning of the book, in the idea of kind of old money versus new money. So, this is not enough to be rich and get accepted by kind of the leisure upper class. You have to do the lifestyle as well. And that's how they distinguish, oh, these people have money, but it's new money. They don't know what they're doing, versus people who have money and they really know the lifestyle. They know the different game and how it's played. And to get accepted into kind of the upper class, those new money people have to kind of relearn their lifestyle and kind of get away from kind of the middle class ways and kind of embrace that old school upper class way of living. So here again, we start to see kind of the micro and macro levels getting connected. The culture on the macro level kind of shapes the mind on the micro level. And then, as a result, people start to practice, with their free will, with their agency, all these different games of status. But the games themselves are created by social structures such as culture and capitalism. But still, you can kind of play the games in your own way. You have that free will to dress in the ways you want to dress, albeit kind of within a certain constraints of what's considered to be a positive or what's considered to be negative. So we'll leave that there for today. Just a little bit of discussion in reference to your paper. And for our next class, we'll talk about, basically all the key ideas we mentioned so far, but again, discuss them specifically in reference to the book report guidelines.